So we just talked about the Europeans creating ethnic divides that hadn't previously existed. However, in the Rwanda-Burundi region, there was the division between the Hutus and the Tutsis. The Hutus were agricultural-based Bantu-speaking people, whereas the Tutsis were cattle-based people that came later on into the region. The divide was basically determined by how many cattle you had. If you had 10 or more, you were considered a Tutsi, whereas if you had loosely 10 or less cattle, you were considered a Hutu. However, by the time the colonizers came, that division no longer existed. The people in that region were one. They were united. The Germans arrived in the 19th century, and the power was then given to Belgium. The Belgians, when they arrived, instituted a policy of racial categorization. Why? Because racially based categorization and philosophies were a fixture of European culture at that time. When the Belgians were there, they favored the Tutsis. They spent more time educating them and whatnot, and giving them a more privileged life that the Hutus were denied. Therefore, when independence came around, the Civil War broke out because the Hutu wanted revenge. They wanted revenge for something that hadn't been given to them, that had been given to their brothers wrongly. That Civil War later on led to the 1994 genocide that is depicted in the movie Hotel Rwanda. If I may suggest so, I recommend the movie Shooting Dogs, which is a slightly less Hollywood version than Hotel Rwanda. However, both movies are excellent. In that genocide, the one in 1994, 800,000 Tutsis died. And not only Tutsis, but liberal Hutus as well, who were helping out their Tutsi neighbors and whatnot. 800,000. And you know, it's hard not to look back on history and blame the Europeans, but whether we can blame or not, 800,000 is an unforgivable number, and the world vowed never to forget, yet we still have different genocides happening in Africa and around that region. So that's Rwanda. Now moving on to Nigeria. Alright, the Portuguese were the first to arrive. It's actually kind of random, but it's still common for Nigerians to have Portuguese last names, which I find really interesting. In 1900, the power was switched to the Brits, and the Brits spent more resources on the south than on the north. They spent more resources on education, on developing infrastructure, and that division still exists today. And the north is characterized by being less developed. Also, I forgot to mention, when we think Nigeria nowadays, it's very common to link it with the natural resource that they have, that being oil. We live in an oil-hungry era, and having that wealth of oil it's hard to tell if that's something good or bad to have right now, especially when there's a land that's more vulnerable to corruption, as is the case in Nigeria, because that just feeds into more wealth inequality. Also, if you guys are interested, and I really encourage you to do this, I would check out how Shell is involved in Nigeria, Shell, the oil company, because if we fill up our pumps 3 times a week, twice a week, once a week, whatever, at stations such as Shell, I mean, it's whether you choose to boycott it is totally your decision, but again, we should all be informed on what's happening. They have a lot of human rights abuses against them, and it's just a good thing to research. Alright, so after World War II, Nigerian nationalism was growing, and as I mentioned earlier, during the 60s, after World War II, this was the trend in Africa. Independence was on the mind of all Africans. There was definitely a new movement beginning, and it was a time of change. In 1960, Nigeria got its independence, and in 1963 it became a republic. In its first democratic elections, the Yoruba people interfered. The Yoruba candidate hadn't been elected. However, he he said that the Yoruba people had had an incredibly developed system of governance before the colonizers had come. So now that the country was independent, they should take their system of governance back. And it's hard to say like who was right and who was wrong, but it's just a good example of a country that from the get-go had unstable elections, and that's a trend that's continued through Nigeria's history, one of not only political instability, but instability in the institutions as well, and it still continues today. If you look in the newspaper, Nigeria is still plagued by that sort of thing. So, from the get-go, there was corruption. Alright, so Zimbabwe. And the thing about Zimbabwe is that when I was on my semester with the traveling school, our driver, Papa, we called him Papa because he took on a father figure, and Ungwe, our cook, were both from Zimbabwe. They're from the Harare region, approximately. And whenever we had free period, they would kind of call us over, and we'd kind of huddle, and they were so proud of the country, and they just wanted us to know as much as we could about what was happening. And it was just such an amazing experience to hear all those things first-handedly, from experience that they had experienced personally, being truck drivers crossing borders, or with the food insecurity that their families had to bear. So, Zimbabwe.